Eh bien, je vous propose d'accueillir Bill Todd. Hello, Bill. Can you hear us?
Yes. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for joining us. Sorry for the 15 minutes late. Can you move a little bit on your right? Because you're like just on the edge. So can you just translate yourself a little bit? Yes, that's perfect. Thank you very much. So you're live here in Paris. Everyone says hello to you. I just introduced you before you joined us on Skype, and I introduced your curricula, and I spoke a little bit about Neemo, and we have your presentation, so the floor is yours.
Well, there you go. Well, thank you, Ariel. Good evening, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to spend a few minutes with me. I'll do this presentation in English. Unfortunately, the version of French that I would use probably is one that you've never heard, so we'll go with English. I'm here in San Diego, and feel very fortunate to speak with you all tonight about two of my favorite subjects, sea and space, and talk a little bit about why these two have so much in common and how at NASA we use this as an advantage and use both of them together. So with that, I assume, Ariel, we are on the first slide there of Aquarius. Is that correct? Okay. Well, if you can still hear me, Ariel, I can't hear anything from...
Can you hear me now?
So are you still with me?
I'm still with you, and I'm on the first page.
Okay, wonderful. So a shout out to my friend there, Jean-Francois, my good friend in undersea and space exploration and fun. So I hope he's having a good day as well.
Hello, Bill. Hello.
Hello.
I wait for my ticket to go into Aquarius with you.
You know that you're welcome anytime, mon ami. Okay. Well, with that, let's get started, and we'll jump to the first slide, please. You know, the name of the program is Neemo, and you might be able to tell from this slide that I'm a big fan of Jules Verne and 20,000 Leagues, and if you haven't read it, then I recommend that you do. But it's interesting how many similarities there are in exploration and how he actually got it right so early on. Next slide. But what we're going to focus today is on how NASA uses undersea exploration and how, after years in working in the space industry, as I was a shuttle instructor, a space shuttle and space station instructor for many years, how we realized that it was important to do undersea exploration and use the undersea as an analog or a similar environment to living and working in space. And in this slide, you can see some graphic images of what it might look like to ascend and depart from the Mars surface in your mothership. Next slide. In our program, the Aquarius undersea habitat you see pictured here is in Key Largo, Florida. It's in 20 meters of water, about 5 kilometers offshore. This is the world's only undersea research habitat, and it followed, previously there was about 63 undersea habitats in the world, which, as you probably know, started right there in the coast of France, in Marseille, and in Monaco, with all of the programs that were done by Cousteau, and we're living and working in the sea. So that's the great heritage that we have when we're working under the sea. Aquarius is about 10 meters long and 4 meters wide and has a crew of 6 people. Next slide. It's located, as I said, in about 20 meters of water in a wonderful environment that is full of corals and a broad diversity of fish, and goes in a range of depth anywhere from about 10 meters to 35 meters. It's full of nice coral channels and paths that make it a wonderful place for exploration. Next. We use quite a bit of topside resources to conduct these missions. In this slide, you can see one of our ships that we use to deploy our research submersibles when we execute the missions. This particular ship is called the Liberty Star, and this is the ship that NASA used to recover the solid rocket motors that were used on the space shuttle when they land in the ocean. This is the ship that we used to recover them with the dive team. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about a mission, an undersea mission that NASA uses at the Aquarius habitat. Let's take a little journey on what it feels like and what a day is like. In this first slide, you can see one of our astronauts preparing to go on a spacewalk, or in this case, a sea walk, which is designed to be very much like something that they would experience on the surface of Mars or perhaps the Moon. We use technical diving equipment such as the Superlight diving helmet. We have live video, live communication, and we're working directly with the Mission Control Center with about 100 people supporting the mission. We carry all of our equipment with us, and we're out in the water on these dives for up to 5 hours. Next slide. We accomplished this by going through what we call the Wet Porch, and the Wet Porch is the air and sea interface. So as we're living in Aquarius, we're at what we call ambient water pressure. That means the pressure inside of the habitat is at the same pressure as the surrounding water column. That allows us to go in and out of the water anytime we want for extended periods of time. This model, staying on the bottom, is called saturation diving, and that's what commercial divers do. It's called saturation diving because your blood becomes saturated with nitrogen, just like if you would take an extended scuba dive. Next. This graphic represents what it might look like if the astronauts were on the surface of Mars, going out, performing a spacewalk, and doing sample collection, using geological tools, exploring the surface of Mars, and doing this all, of course, under Martian gravity. We do the same thing. Next. In this image, you can see two of our aquanauts that are weighed out to a Martian gravity that are undertaking all different types of tasks on the seafloor. Next slide. Inside the habitat, we also have some of the astronauts, what we call the interior astronauts, the IV, intervehicular astronauts, that are managing the spacewalk and making sure that all of the objectives get accomplished. This is a very busy role inside the habitat. We monitor their biometric data, we monitor video, audio, the timeline for the tasks, and this person talks to the mission control. It's a very busy job and very important for long-duration space exploration. Next. In this slide, you can see one of our aquanauts in an asteroid gravity. Asteroid means you're absent gravity. There is no gravity. It's a very difficult situation to work, but we need to learn how to work in a zero-gravity environment so that we can explore an asteroid or perhaps a moon of Mars like Phobos and Deimos. Or when we are working on the International Space Station, that is a microgravity or a zero-gravity extravehicular activity or spacewalk. Here we're demonstrating how we use tools, perhaps on an asteroid. This is extremely difficult. The surface of an asteroid is such that you cannot even anchor to it. Imagine you taking your hand and punching it all the way through the asteroid to the other side. That's how amorphous some of the surface of the asteroids are. Next slide. What we've done is we've combined marine science as an analog for Martian geological science. And we've partnered with universities to help study the corals and the sponges in the reef in such a way that is similar to exploring on Mars. Next slide. We go out in teams of 2 to look at the different sites, record data, and send that data back to Mission Control. And we do this all under what we call a time delay of about 15 minutes each way. That's extremely hard to do. Imagine you asking a question and you cannot get a response for 30 minutes. And you're trying to be productive for your 4 to 5 hours, but every question takes 30 minutes to get a response. It makes for a very inefficient extravehicular activity, and we need to come up with ways to make this much more efficient. Next slide. This device here allows us to monitor the corals and the health of the corals with a device that's very sophisticated undersea device and is looking at the light spectrum of the coral, and that will tell us the health. The point of that is, once again, this is not a tool we would use on Mars. There is no corals on Mars, obviously. Well, as far as we know, there's no corals. But certainly, you can understand how a technical device like this would be similar to something that we would look for and use on the surface of Mars. Next slide. Again, another picture of exploring the surface, and notice that in that picture you can see one of our umbilicals. And this is the line that goes back to the habitat that supplies our oxygen, our air, our video, and our communication. Next slide. This slide shows you some of the equipment that we have built, purpose-built for working underwater, but again, it's an analog for Mars exploration. These are concepts of a drill that you would use on the surface of an asteroid. On the left side of the picture, you can see actually something that looks like a rock wall or a climbing wall that's used in a gym. That's exactly what it is. We built the world's first undersea climbing wall, and we're using it to determine how steep of an angle that we could work on an asteroid surface. Next, please. And again, here is another picture of the drill, and flying by on the back of that, you can see one of our devices that our topside team is using that we use to move around in the seafloor. That's a diver propulsion vehicle with undersea navigation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Next, please. Part of the other things that we do as tasks are we build structures, and we call these pioneering tasks. So on the surface of Mars or the Moon, not only do we explore and look for new places to live and work, but we also build things, construction. These next 2 slides, and you can move to the next slide, please, show one of the towers that we have built in cooperation with the university. That is an analog for building communication towers on the Martian surface. Next slide. If we're on the same slides together, you should see a vehicle on the seafloor and a mock-up of a lander. On top of that lander is a habitat. We built this full-scale mock-up of a lunar lander with a lunar rover and a lunar habitat on top to evaluate what it's like to live and work on these environments and come up with things, tackle such challenges as how do we get to the moon's surface from the top of the lander? How do we rescue somebody from the seafloor and bring them up to the top of the lander? All of this, again, is done in a lunar gravity that simulates what it would be like to have to work in those conditions. Next slide, please. This slide is showing some of the activities that we do during exploration, such as collecting water samples. Next slide. And using technological, really highly developed technology, such as undersea navigation equipment here. In this slide, you'll appreciate this device that is basically an underwater GPS. It uses a Doppler velocity algorithm to calculate movement on the seafloor. We translate that movement into a program that if you know where you're starting, it will tell you where you are in reference to your starting point, and you can return to that starting point. It's very accurate, and it's extremely useful when we're trying to explore. We won't have GPS on Mars, but we will have some type of a device to help us navigate. Next. This slide shows two pictures of one of our latest acquisitions, which is kind of fun. It's called an iDive, and it's a housing for an iPad. It allows the iPad to be pressurized, and we can use it up to 100 meters deep. We pressurize it just slightly over ambient so we can use the touchscreen. On that, we keep all of our procedures, tasks, timelines, all of our activities are kept on this electronic cue card, just like we would in space, and it's all available to us. Next slide. The last slide here of exploration technology shows working on a boom. And the concept with the boom is if you can't work on an asteroid surface, perhaps you can deploy a boom that will allow you to extend away from your habitat and go out further, and you can translate along the boom. So this next slide is a graphic of the Martian surface and how we're going to use robotics in conjunction with manned exploration. Next. One of our ROVs that we use is a small ROV, that remotely operated vehicle, that is very similar to a robotic device that we'd use on Mars. Next slide. In this slide, you can see one of our aquanauts actually working with a remotely operated vehicle. And the remotely operated vehicle, which is being driven by mission control, is actually bringing the aquanaut some tools that we needed and is returning to the habitat with samples that the aquanaut just took from the surface. We call this the man-machine interface, and it's very important for not only astronauts, but for also for the sophisticated navies of the world and how they work with robotics. Next slide. Once again, you can see in this picture one of our aquanauts working directly with one of the remotely operated vehicles. Next, please. In this graphic, you can see that we are living in a mothership, our habitat on Mars, but we also will need a way to be transported around the surface. We're not always going to be walking. And depending upon the type of environment that we're in, there's different devices that we'd use. Well, we don't have those exact devices undersea, but what we do have is models of them in different ways to be transported undersea. Next slide. Here you can see two of the Newtco Deep Worker 2000 submersibles. These are one-man piloted submersibles that we use to translate the astronauts around the seafloor. In this slide, you can see two of our astronaut/aquanauts on what we call a portable foot restraint on the front of the submersible, and they're being driven around the seafloor by one of our pilots. This is very similar to what we would do on an asteroid surface or perhaps the Mars surface. Next slide. Here you can see a small diver propulsion vehicle transporting one of our aquanauts around the seafloor. An excellent way to translate around the seafloor and get us somewhere quickly and efficiently. Next slide. Again, here is a submersible with an astronaut working just next to one of the mock-ups that we have of the lunar lander. Next slide. This is what we call crew incapacitation exercise, where we're transporting an injured aquanaut, simulated injured aquanaut, back to the habitat to determine what type of techniques we would use in this type of situation. So real quickly, let's finish this up by jumping into what it's like inside the habitat while we're doing all of these activities outside. Next slide. Here you should see one of our aquanauts with the Microsoft HoloLens 3D system that we're using to simulate a 3D graphical representation in MCC that Mission Control Center, can monitor what the aquanaut is seeing. This is used for inventory of the habitat, it's used for diagnosis of malfunctions, and it's used for medical situations. Next slide, you can see, same thing, our crew working on one of the other crew, and this information is relayed back to a medical doctor. Next slide. One of my favorite things is telemedicine, and telemedicine, or remote virtual medicine, here is being demonstrated. Next slide. And here you can see one of our aquanauts performing telesurgery with a doctor 5,000 kilometers away. This is done under slight comm delay of 2 seconds. Extremely difficult to do telemedicine under communication delay and have it be acceptable and safe way to do surgery. Next slide. Some of the other science we perform is neuroscience in an isolated extreme environment. Next slide. And of course, we do a lot of work on nutrition and health and well-being of the astronauts. Next slide, please. Here you can see one of our aquanauts, one of the ESA aquanauts, probably a friend of Jean-Francois, performing some of our science in the habitat. And next slide, one of the NASA astronauts looking at the timeline and looking at some equipment right inside the habitat with a nice view outside of her window. Next slide. 3 weeks ago, I was performing a week-long mission, and in this slide, you can see what is a DNA sequencer. So we did the first undersea DNA sequencing, which has become a very interesting and popular thing in the medical community, and it's going to be of quite a benefit to space exploration in the future. Next slide. One of our happy crews in the Wet Porch just before they're ready to come back to the surface. Next slide shows you my crew 2 weeks ago just before decompression. Decompression is a 15-hour exercise that you must perform before returning to the surface. You breathe pure oxygen before you do that. And once you perform that, you can come back to the surface with no ill effects whatsoever. So with that, I think I've used up my time, hopefully efficiently. So next slide. I will just ask if there is any questions. Or Ariel, I don't know how you want to move forward, but I'm happy to take a few questions if you'd like, or whatever you would like to do. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I believe you can hear your applause. It was a very fantastic presentation. Works very well. Thank you. Thank you very much. We are running out of time, but I'm sure Jean-François will have a question for Bill.
Billy Bob speaking. I can't wait.
Maybe we can take one or two questions just for Bill, and then on va prendre une ou deux questions adressées à Bill, et puis après je vous propose, comme on est un petit peu en retard, je ne veux pas vous retenir plus, que les autres questions, on vous y répond pendant le cocktail, si ça vous va, qui est juste à côté. Une ou deux questions à Bill Todd? No? No question? Okay.
Wow. Okay.
Wait, one question here. Wait. No. You need the mic. Vous devez avoir le micro. Here's a question.
Yes. Thank you. I read a few months ago, or maybe a year, that the Aquarius was going to be scrapped, and congratulations, you managed to save it.
So let me guess, you read this on the internet. Yeah, no. So that's a good question, or a good point. It wasn't really ever going to be scrapped. It was NOAA, which was the agency in the U.S., the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, decided that they didn't want to support it anymore. That was the issue. And then a private university, or a university, took over the ownership of it, and that's what happened.
Okay, very good.
And it's hopefully has a bright future. So thank you. And Billy Bob, by the way, I heard you, and yes, I'm looking forward to the day that you and I can spend some time together in the habitat. That would be wonderful.
Godspeed, Aquarius.
Well, thank you very much. Bill, thank you for joining us. Another question? One more question. Okay. On peut dire que c'est aussi Bill qui a pratiquement aussi sauvé Aquarius.
Just a quick question. Are you guys working with the United States Navy in any way?
Oh, absolutely. On a lot of different levels. One of the reasons why I'm here in San Diego, as a matter of fact. So we work with the Navy in many different ways. I'll give you a few examples. Some of the robotics that you saw are from the Navy Postgraduate School in Monterey. All of the sophisticated diver propulsion vehicles, all of those are by contractors that are designing equipment, and we're testing it to ensure that it's high-fidelity equipment that can be used by the Navy, so it's a very good partnership. The tables, the science that we're doing and the medical science that we're doing is sponsored in part by the Office of Naval Research. We do all types of testing that is in line with what the Navy would do. And as a matter of fact, quite a few, or several of my staff, including the diving medical officer, are brought in from the U.S. Navy to support our missions. Great question.
Plus d'autres questions? Okay, no more question for you. Thank you again. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a nice day in San Diego. Say hello for us to the Pacific, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a nice evening. Okay.
Thank you very much. Bye.
All right. Bye.